I have to say, I'm just so impressed with how many folks you've connected with, and just, I mean, I tried to do a podcast for a little bit, and I understand like the kind of behind the scene. It's a lot of work. I wasn't able to keep up with it, but like, thank you so much, because it's so important to get stories out there to address stigma, like it's just such a huge, huge issue.
Yep. No, it is. And I would say I took off like 3 months at one point because of how much it was.
Yeah.
And it got overwhelming. And like, I don't know, this is even crazier to tell you. In September of 2022, it's Recovery Month.
Yeah.
So to celebrate Recovery Month, I released an episode every single day that month. I did 30 episodes in 30 days.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm assuming you don't do this for like your full-time job either.
No, I don't. No. And then for the holidays that same year, I put out an episode every day from Thanksgiving to New Year's Eve.
Wow.
It's like 40 episodes I did in a row. And
that's amazing. Well, good for you. And do you have like a sponsor or anything like that, or sponsorships? No, not yet.
BetterHelp. I have BetterHelp as a sponsor.
Oh, nice.
Like even this episode's BetterHelp is the sponsor.
Okay.
Pop up halfway through.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that. Thank you. Thank you for being on the show, Caroline.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be with you.
Yeah. What's your recovery date?
It is January 2nd of 2011. So I just celebrated 13 years.
2011. Wow.
Yes. So I am into the double digits now. I know sometimes it's like, ooh, I'm getting old in recovery, but it's a beautiful thing. I spent my entire decade of my 30s in recovery. It's been amazing.
I started when I was 31.
Great.
That's not my sober date. That's my date that I found recovery for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
I was 20 years old, and I was drinking for 20 years, and I did drugs for 10 years. Okay. So by the time I was 31, I was done. I sent myself to rehab, and I think that's why I let people be like, here's AA. You have to go to 2 meetings a day. And that kind of thing. And I think that's why I can do so many podcasts, is because I used to go to so many meetings. And that's what this is. This is a meeting is 2 people having a conversation about recovery.
Right.
So these are my meetings. I don't go in person anymore, really, unless I'm like collecting a chip.
Yeah.
But if I'm not collecting a chip, these are my meetings. And like you said, you know how hard it is to make these. So I do these because they help me stay sober. And when I stop doing these, I start having that mindset again, and it starts creeping in back in my head. Said like, you can drink, you can do this, and it's okay. And I can't drink, and I can't do this. So recovery is a learning process, I feel like. Now, what were your drugs of choice, or was it drinking?
Well, I loved it all. I think I started off, as many of us do, kind of, what was I, middle school, smoking cigarettes, in the woods, sneaking out with my friends, so it was like, looking back now, I just see I had so many addictive tendencies. I mean, I grew up, around substances. And so it was just kind of like a spiral for me, from cigarettes out in the woods, to beer, to drinking, to cannabis, to, ultimately, cocaine was huge for me, opiates, just kind of like the gamut of substances. So I like to say I was, escape is definitely my drug of choice. So whatever can lead me and help me to escape myself was kind of where I went. That was my coping strategy for life and everything that I was, trying to run from.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. I lived in 5 different states in a matter of like 6-7 years.
Wow.
Because I kept going like, well, if I'm in North Carolina, I don't know anybody, and I won't do my drugs. And next thing you know, I'm paying for somebody to overnight me drugs from New Jersey, and to go to the post office and literally stuff them in like a box of like treats, like candy, and stuff it in there like a little baggie, and then overnight them to me.
Mm-hmm.
So like even though I was in North Carolina, I was still getting stuff from Jersey. And then plus I was at the bar 6 days a week.
Yeah.
Like I had just lost my fiance to suicide. So like
Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
I needed a way out. That was 8 years ago this past July. I'm married now, so I was engaged twice, but never really didn't end either of them. But I can cope with it better now than I did for a while because I, as
Mhm.
you can imagine, self-medicated. Did you grow up around alcohol?
Yeah, yeah. So I grew up in the Midwest, Wisconsin. So we had a lot of drinking, just was a part of life, you know. So I think I learned early on that, you know, if you're celebrating, if it's been a rough day, you know, kind of whatever the situation, alcohol was kind of what everyone did. So I just remember even at, you know, like 11 years old, I think was my first drink, feeling a sense of relief almost, you know, after taking that first drink,
I was
even
11.
at such a
I
young
was
age.
11 too.
Were you? Yeah.
Yeah, and it was more like I was watching this movie, The Outsiders,
Hmm.
and I fell in love with that movie, and they were like teenagers drinking. And like my friend and I would drink and watch this movie, but we were drinking like on Saturday nights when like my parents went to bed and he was sleeping over, and
Mm-hmm.
like sneak alcohol from their basement. And my first drink was Captain and Coke.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I remember
you're like the
Captain and Cokes. Yep.
you're like the fifth or sixth person that's been on my show from Wisconsin,
Really?
and
Wow.
they all say the same thing, and it's beer when they were young.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
then so like when you started saying that, I was like, oh, that makes sense.
Mhm.
That makes sense. So you grew up around alcohol, you grew up around beer too. That's even easier to like sneak because it's cheaper. Um, how long until you found cocaine?
You know, surprisingly not very long. I think I was 15 when I started, and just kind of found myself, you know, I think as sometimes as a woman in, you know, the cycle and that just scene of addiction, there we're just vulnerable. I think everyone's vulnerable, but you know, my experience as a woman struggling with addiction, I was just vulnerable to people who were a little bit further along in the addiction cycle. So I was, you know, dating guys that were older, just really who were involved in kind of that heavier drug scene, dealing, kind of all of those things. So I just it felt like I all of a sudden I woke up and I was, you know, addicted to cocaine. And I was 15 years old, and it was a very quick spiral for me, 2 years, and then I experienced an overdose that was very scary, and that was New Year's Eve of 1999. I'm going to date myself there, um, and that was my after that time was kind of when I first really woke up to the fact that I had a choice to make, and it was either to continue down this road and I was likely going to die, or, you know, start living my life. And so, you know, I say my sobriety date is January 2nd, 2011, but I really started on a recovery journey back when I was 17 years old. You know, I didn't maintain abstinence after that point, but it was kind of the beginning of my recovery journey.
It was that seed that was planted
Mm-hmm.
in the back of your head.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what were you escaping from so early on? Like you said, you were addicted to escapism, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I know mine was grief and loss and losing because like I found alcohol when I was 11, but I
Mm-hmm.
didn't drink alcoholically until I was 12, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because a friend of ours passed away,
Mm-hmm.
and I said to my friend like, "Hey, if we drink, we're gonna feel better." So to me, that's being like, "Oh, I was drinking alcoholically to escape at 12."
Mm-hmm.
So what were you escaping from?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to say, you know, I'm sorry you experienced that. And I think grief still is. And maybe we can talk about this at some point. My dad passed away a couple months ago unexpectedly. And even having over a decade, you know, in recovery, decade in abstinence-based recovery, it really shook me. So I'd love to talk more about that. And grief, especially as a young child, I mean, when we don't have those healthy models of coping, you know, or support, it's just so, you know, that for me, it felt so easy, an easy option to help deal with things. So it was grief also for me. I lost my grandpa, who pretty much raised my brother and I, in a sense, for some time. And I mentioned, being vulnerable as a woman in active addiction, experienced, multiple traumas related to, sexual violence. I don't want to get into the details and, have this be super triggering for folks. But those experiences, I think, really not only affected my self-worth, but led me to just want to completely numb myself out, and unfortunately what ended up happening then was just this cycle and this pattern of abusive relationships and just unhealthy, lack of boundaries. And, so it was just this traumatic cycle that continued for me until my mid-20s. I experienced a couple instances of assault. And so I think for a long time I was trying to escape those feelings. And also what I didn't realize, because, and back 20 years ago, I mean, people, well, maybe more than 20 years ago now, people weren't talking about sexual violence in the way that they are now, and addiction, we just, in mental health, yeah. We just weren't as open about it. So what I know now from years of therapy and recovery is that I had post-traumatic stress disorder, and I didn't realize I was actually self-medicating those symptoms of heightened anxiety and fear and, all of these things. So for me, escaping my trauma symptoms and escaping that feeling of just no self-worth. I mean, I just thought I was just not worth living.
Well, sorry about your dad. My dad passed away in June.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. So I definitely feel that kind of pain. It wasn't sudden for him. He had cancer, and it beat him up pretty badly. And by the end, he couldn't really get out of bed. So it was more of a slow thing than like that. You know what I mean? So I can't imagine if it was sudden and out of nowhere, because that's that's more traumatic if it happened sudden and out of nowhere, in my opinion. And it's because I got a chance to give him a proper goodbye. He passed away on a Monday, but that Friday before, he had an intubator. He was intubated, but he was able to write. So right now on my wall, I have a little shrine to him, and hanging up, I have one of his notes that he wrote in a frame. So
that's sweet.
Yeah, so I'm reminded, I have some of his ashes too. So, I have the watch that he wore when he was in the viewing. So I have a bunch of things that remind me of him in my office. So that for me is a coping mechanism. That's something I have this on my work desk, and it's a heavy duty hourglass, and it does a half an hour worth of time. And so I do it when I'm working. It helps me pass the time because I'm constantly seeing the time moving, and I'll have to watch seconds on my phone. So how do you cope with something that happens so sudden?
Well, like I said, it really shook me, and thank God for recovery and just the supports that I have. And I think, what I continually learn as as the years kind of add up in recovery is that, life is still going to keep happening. We're not promised an easy life, trouble-free life. Just because we find recovery does not mean we will not have trouble in this life. And what we do have, though, in recovery are tools that we can use and coping strategies that are healthy. And so, I reached out to my support system. There's one woman in particular, and she's got decades in recovery, and is in, quote unquote old timer. But, she is just my go-to person. When I have those major life things, and she still lives in Wisconsin. I live in Tennessee now, but, I reached out to her and just, let things out. And I told on myself. I mean, I called some close friends and needed that accountability and say, I hate to admit this, but my first thought, one of my first thoughts, aside from immense grief, and I'm sorry if I get emotional, I've just been, grief comes in waves. But one of my first thoughts was I need a pack of cigarettes. There was a lot of alcohol around after the service. Someone I used to date was actually at the funeral. There were just all of these
triggers.
Directions I could have chosen to go that I know would have offered me very fleeting moments of comfort. But I know that because I reached out, because I was honest, because I told on myself, like, I'm not going to pretend because I have how many years in recovery and I wrote a book, or I'm writing books on it or blah, 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 that I have it all together. No, I need to continually practice my own recovery because we are very close to going back out. I believe that, like, we have to continually maintain that contact, for me with God and with other people, to just, be able to stay, in recovery. And in the past couple of months, I mean, it's been a movement through feeling really triggered to like go to my old ways to this beautiful, like, I just feel so close to my dad now, and I feel closer to him now than I did when he was alive. And I also made like a kind of a shrine type, like I had pictures of him and I had flowers. I don't right now, but was having flowers every week, fresh flowers, and this candle, and just remembering my dad has been really helpful. But I'm so grateful that I could go through that sober. Like, and I told myself, I remember at the service, I had to leave this. I just had to get out of there. I needed some air. And I went outside. It was a beautiful day. And I sat down by a tree and I just started talking to my dad. And, I was a little bit angry at him. And then I was like, Dad, I know that the last thing you would want for me right now is to go back out, as a way to deal with what's going on. And I want to honor your memory. And my dad, used substances for a long time. So I feel like a way that I can honor his memory is to continue living in recovery, which he was so proud of me. I think it challenged his own use, but in a good way. But I know he was proud of me.
Yeah. And I can say it, once I heard those words for the first time, because after so long in addiction and breaking my family's heart over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? And then like them asking me to go to rehab countless times and me just saying, I don't need to go to rehab. I don't need to go to rehab. I got this on my own. But I never even really gave it an honest try. I went to one meeting one time, and the entire time ahead, I'm like, all right, 55 minutes to go, 45 minutes to go. I'm not listening to anything that's being said. I'm just talking to myself because I know best. That was the kind of mentality at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Until I wasn't, I was sober going to meetings because I wanted to be there. Then like you can hear yourself in anybody. If someone's talking about something that has nothing to do with you, but then they say, "Oh, I was the oldest of three," I'm like, "That's me. I can relate to you now."
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to relate yourself to anybody in your stories, and I particularly love doing these because I can find myself in everybody's story and I can relate to people, and it makes me feel better that I'm not alone. And I think that's a lot what recovery is finding your people. Like my person that I always call to like unload my shit is in California.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But she answers the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a busy painter. She is a graffiti artist and she's known all around the world. And that's how I met her, was in the rooms. And I was like, I want to hang around you and watch you paint. And then she had a tattoo kit and she ended up giving me like 20 of my tattoos.
Oh,
just
wow. That's
just
awesome.
in her front yard in Venice. So not like in a tattoo shop, just hanging out doing meetings in her front yard and
Wow.
giving
That's
out
really
tattoos.
special.
This podcast is also sponsored by BetterHelp. If you are looking for therapy and not able to get something right away locally, you can do that with them. Within 48 hours, you can find a therapist to get on telehealth with you. I mean, I haven't heard anything but great things from people that have already done it, that watch my show or listen to my show. If you're looking to get 10% off your first month, you can go to betterhelp.com/MJsPNPMCA. That is betterhelp.com/MJsPNPMCA.
So it's all a great experience that I had in recovery early on. And I think that's what sets the tone, is how you receive it early on, as opposed to people that are there because they have to get a court slip signed.
Mm-hmm.
you know, you've seen those people that come in with slips to get them signed, and you know that they didn't pay attention to anything. They didn't speak up or talk the entire meeting. They're just there to get their slip signed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely hear that. And I think that really points to why I feel it's so important, like things that you're doing, sharing your podcast and helping, get stories of recovery out there. Think it's so important to make sure that we have access, like those of us who are in or seeking recovery have access to supports that can actually help, like recovery housing, like quality treatment, like peer support, like what you're talking about, just connection. So part of what I'm passionate about in, my writing and work is advocacy and making sure that we continue to share our stories. I know some folks kind of get uncomfortable with that, like the public sharing, that whole idea of anonymity. But I love learning more about kind of the history of that, kind of way back when with the 12-step fellowship starting. And, anonymity isn't about not telling our stories. It was more about protecting that particular recovery pathway, to make sure that, ego wasn't super involved. But I think, and even the early founders of AA, for example, were involved with sharing their stories of recovery to policymakers and stuff. Marty Mann and, Bill Wilson, like all of those folks. So I'm really passionate about doing that. And again, I'm so glad that we could connect today, because it's another opportunity to do that. And I think it's a way to give back. Like you said, your podcast is a way for you to connect. And I feel that too.
And how this all started was because of what you're talking about. Kind of, my wife and I ran a recovery center where we had meetings all day long. Mm-hmm. And that's why this podcast isn't called JD's, it's called MJ's, is because that was the name of our meeting center, was MJ's Progress, Not Perfection. So nice. I started a podcast with the same name in hopes of, making money in order to pay our bills. Mm-hmm. And that's why I was doing it full time for a little while. Mm-hmm. And then once we stopped getting like sponsorships, I had to go back to work, and couldn't do this as much. Like I could never do work and one episode a day. Mm-hmm. That is right. Just so much work goes into one episode. Mm-hmm. So I know you know that. And so you said you wrote a book.
I have, yeah. I actually have it here. I'd love to send you a free copy. I love sending it out. It's called Downstairs Church. Okay. Finding Hope in the Grit of Addiction and Trauma Recovery. And so I talk about Downstairs Church is kind of one of my favorite authors referenced the concept, like we have this vision in our mind of what recovery is, right? It's like church basements and stale coffee and, a bunch of old men smoking cigarettes, their, bowler hats on or whatever. But I talk about, this whole idea of bringing recovery into the light and into the, quote unquote upstairs, but that it doesn't exist in the secretive downstairs place, that it is meant to be shared and meant to be lived in the light. And I talk about, finding hope in the grit is part of the subtitle. I talk about some really gritty experiences, not just that I've had, but other folks, of course, respecting anonymity and getting folks, all of that kind of stuff. But, talk about some really gritty experiences, and then ways that myself and others have found recovery, through connection and through things like recovery housing. So I'm hoping that it's been a tool to get folks, not only who aren't in recovery, but learn more about it and provide ways for folks to get involved. And I love to share this story, but I go to a small church here in Eastern Tennessee. And one of the folks who go to our church is just an older gentleman. He read a copy of this and was so moved that he actually now donates thousands of dollars a year to a recovery housing fund that our church manages to help people access treatment. And we've started a recovery program in the church, not celebrate, but just like peer-based, come show up, let's share stories. Nothing against Celebrate Recovery, but so, anyways, I was joking with not joking, but I talked to my husband. I was like, if that was the whole purpose of me writing this book, is to just have this fund set up to get folks into housing in Eastern Tennessee, it was 100% worth, the hours that it took to write it and to
sit down. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Writing a book is never easy to do. I've attempted, but I could never get like really started. And I knew that when you're meant to write something, you kind of like, once you start, you can't stop. As opposed to if you have trouble starting, maybe it's not the story you need to tell yet. And that's how I felt when I was like, not, I gave up on it, but like I more like put it on the shelf. Like later I'll go to it and reference it and use it. But for now, I tell my story all the time when I'm talking to people like you and I'm trying to find ways to relate. That's how I tell my story too, is by putting my business out there and being vulnerable and, you know, feeling those feelings even when they're not great. Because I was in the height of my addiction when my, you know, first fiance passed away. So like I didn't take that well at all. People blamed me, like her family blamed me, and like I did not drive her to that. She was sick. She was bipolar and schizophrenic. So she was very sick and I couldn't help her anymore. And I did everything I could in 3 years that we were together, and we grew up together too. So it was a sudden loss, and I knew how that felt. Like I know how it felt when her mom called me to tell me. And I went straight to like drinking and using again to numb how I was feeling. And I didn't ever like feel my feelings until like 3 years later, because like you said, your advice was to reach out to people. And that was the advice I got too, was you need to reach out to people. So like one of my best friends died in a car accident in 2012. And so when I started feeling those feelings in 2018 for the first time on the anniversary of his death, you know, my sponsor was like, does he have siblings? I'm like, yeah, 3 sisters. He was like, call one of the sisters and see how they're doing. And because if you're having a rough day, so are one of them. And maybe just like letting them vent is going to make their day better, which will make your day better. I was like, okay. And that's exactly what happened. I talked to one of the sisters. We talked for like an hour on the phone, and we both felt better about it because we interacted. We said it out loud. I think when you talk about grief out loud, you're letting go of it, and it's not hurting as much.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, again, I'm so sorry you had to experience that. It sounds like you were able to move to a place of being able to connect about it and share openly about it. And I mean, that's such a beautiful thing about the recovery journey. And whether it's like addiction recovery, grief recovery, you know, divorce, you know, whatever the thing is, I believe we're all in recovery from something, right? But when we're able to reach out and just share and connect with another human being on that human level and just like let it out, there's something really beautiful and I think miraculous almost that happens when we let that stuff out of our minds and our hearts, and we can connect with another human being about that, who can tell us like, hey, me too. You know, I've experienced this too. I don't know. There's something just so beautiful about what happens when 2 people can connect, you know, like we're doing today, but can connect around a shared story, a shared human experience.
Yeah, like when you said your dad just passed, in my head, I'm like, well, we're connecting all right. We're going to be able to connect.
Yeah.
Because it's, you know, it's not something that I wish for anybody, is to have to go through, you know, your dad not being here anymore. And but just talking about it, you know, makes me emotional, but at the same time, like, you can breathe through it. You know what I mean? You can take those deep breaths and kind of feel your feelings and know that it's not permanent. This will pass, and just be patient and not try to be the director of this, and because it's not going to go well when you're the director and the writer and you're the actor. I'm sure you heard that analogy by now.
Yeah.
So what took you in 2011? What was it that you were like, January 1st? Was it January 2nd, 2011?
January 2nd. Yeah.
So what happened for January 1st in 2011?
Oh boy. Well, January 1st, it was actually New Year's Eve again. So for whatever reason, New Year's Eve is kind of like a big day in my story. You know, I had that overdose, and New Year's Eve, I had actually strung together 3 years prior to that, and but no support. You know, I was kind of like the dry, whatever, however they phrase it, you know. but I ended up, dating a guy. I just, have a weakness for I want to say cowboys, but anyways, I was tempted and started dating this guy who I knew immediately was not healthy for me, regular drinker, and really loved this guy though. And not blaming it on him, but I started hanging around alcohol more. Not drugs at this point, but alcohol. And I got to a place where, and I knew in my mind, it was like that unhealthy thinking. I kept going around. And it's like, I haven't done this for 3 years. If I cannot do this for 3 years, then maybe I'm actually not an alcoholic. Maybe it was just drug use, in high school. And I was in my 20s, right? So still young, kind of like that whole idea of living in recovery felt a little bit scary. Like I don't want to think long-term about that. And so anyways, I went back out and for over a period of months had a recurrence of use, with this individual. And so New Year's Eve, of course we go out and New Year's Day, I'm, drinking all day. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but I've heard this a lot shared about in the rooms, or it was like, it wasn't working anymore. Like I was drinking so much and it was like I was completely sober. It was a very weird experience. Like I had been to that point where like it stopped working for me, stopped making me feel good, stopped, but to the point of like, I had nothing different was happening. There was no escape. And I remember we were driving to my folks' house, drinking, of course, on the road. And I pulled the mirror down and I looked at my face and I just had this like vision of myself as a 14-year-old girl. And I just said to myself, like, what am I doing? I know this doesn't work. I know this doesn't work. And so when I woke up that next day, and it wasn't really even a conscious decision. It was just like, I just knew I was done. I just knew I was done. So I ended that relationship not shortly after that. And have been continuing on. And what I did differently this time was I actually got connected. It was an outpatient treatment center. They had a group, it was called Connections. They had a group of people in their 20s like me. And it was the first time maybe ever that I felt like I belonged somewhere and that I could really connect with people. It was like, oh my gosh, I can be myself. Like we understand each other. I'm not crazy. I kept hearing my story reflected like you were sharing. I found these connecting points with other human beings and I didn't feel afraid anymore to be honest and to be vulnerable. And from there, it's been an incredible journey, and in recovery, I've gone back to school to get my graduate degree. I've written books, I've gotten married. I've had twin babies when I was 37. Yeah. Just miracles in recovery. I always wanted to be married and have children. Never thought it was going to be my story, but it is today. And all of those things have happened in recovery. And it's a beautiful journey every day.
So then your husband supports obviously you being in recovery.
Mm-hmm. He does 100%. He is not in recovery, although now he probably would say he is, just because, he like has fallen in love with the recovery journey. I mean, we don't have alcohol in the house, certainly not any other substances. He's very supportive. And, he realized kind of looking back, once we got together, he kind of realized maybe some of his, actions weren't super healthy too. So we're just both committed to being healthy and showing our kids what a family in recovery looks like.
Yeah, I want to shout out therapy too, because therapy in the last 6 years that I've been in therapy, every Wednesday at noon, I'm off on Wednesdays from work. I do 4/10s. So I'm off Wednesdays. So every Wednesday I do my meeting, and at 12 o'clock, I have a psychologist that I see once a month. And so it's just me talking all the time between podcasts, my wife has the same sober date as me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wow.
And it's actually leap day. It's 2/29. So
wow.
so we'll have 4 years. And this is the first time we're able to celebrate our anniversary on our anniversary.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow, how special is that? That's really neat.
Well, I got to shout out COVID-19 because we started in February 29th of 2020. Everything shut down by March 13th. So we were 2 weeks in, 13 days into this, and everything shutting down. So we really had to like buckle down and find ways to have a recovery without actually, and that's how we came up with the meeting center, and we opened that up during COVID. And we still were masked, and we followed all the things to be able to be in a room together. And I think people felt more comfortable with their mask on at first, if that makes sense, because you can kind of hide a little bit who you are behind the mask and kind of be more vulnerable for the first time. We also did a meeting every Thursday that was for teens in the LGBTQ community.
Oh, nice. That's
And
great.
we were able to get teens to connect with each other. And there was, probably like 6 of us that would be like the role models, the people they could talk to that have experience in this for years. And we were really big in the LGBTQ community around here when we first opened up. That was because we know how bad mental health is for them, because they're getting made fun of, bullied. Like there were some of them, their parents don't support what they're doing. They think that they're just doing it for attention. So there was a lot of things that we were able to like address and help people be able to be seen for the first time, some of them in their life, 12-year-olds, 13, 14-year-olds, not even like 17, 18. I'm talking like the people that showed up every week, they were probably between the ages of 12 and 15. So that was one of the most important meetings that we did. It wasn't like the weekly AA or weekly NA meeting that I would hold. We did mental health check-ins every night at 8. So if you were having a rough day mentally, if you're bipolar, if you're schizophrenic, you can come on in anyway, and we're going to talk about mental health things. So it was important for us to have a different grouping of meetings and be truly just a meeting center, not an AA center, an NA center. We wanted to like open it up more to different groups, almost like you would see in a church basement.
Right. Yeah. Have you thought about, it sounds like that isn't happening anymore, or have you thought about restarting some of that, or what kind of led to that stopping?
It took so much to keep it going. And then my wife was diagnosed with MS. So she wasn't able to help as much anymore. And I kind of had to go back to work because I couldn't afford, we were funding it on our own for a while, while also living somewhere else. So we were paying our own bills, plus we were paying the bills there. We were getting like probably $500 a month in sponsorship, but that would pay the rent, but it's not to keep the lights on. I worked from home from there remotely. So the internet had to be paid, like we couldn't afford to keep it going, unfortunately, and the bills were mounting up with my wife's MS. We had to like find the right doctor, and that took a minute. So, there was a lot of different factors. And then finally we just like, I don't want to say gave up, but it was more like we submitted. We're like, we can't do this it's not fiscally responsible to do this anymore. So we had to shut it down for that reason. And it sucks. It is what it is, though. At the same, it's like you talk, it's life on life's terms.
Right. I love that.
That's what they say. Yeah, that's what they say a lot in the rooms.
That's what they do say. Yeah, they say it for a reason. Well, I wonder if, speaking of church basements, I wonder if there's a way to, part of what I do like for my day job is actually like help folks kind of develop recovery services and different things. But I wonder if there's a way to maybe partner with a church or someplace that would offer that free space. Maybe we can connect offline about that at some point. But sounds like a really important service. And I love that you're, offering support for youth too, especially around specific, areas and, when folks are looking at identity, issues, and that's so important. And I was just looking at the time. I have to go shortly here. Speaking of my kiddos,
that's fine. I appreciate you coming on, and I'll give you my address for that book. So I look forward to read. I love books. So I would love to check that out. And if you want, send me the link to it. So if you're listening or watching, it'll be in the description. So you can just click on it and get sent right to the book.
I would
So
love that. I would love to share. And just speaking of too, you mentioned you're writing, thinking about writing a book. I'm actually going to be starting a couple different courses. I would love to send you it just like, for free. But it's actually on writing recovery and kind of my own journey through publishing. And just for folks who are kind of like not sure and wondering what the steps are and the important pieces of kind of publishing today
yeah,
and
send me that.
sharing
My
recovery.
wife is writing. She's starting to
Okay.
write about herself. So
Okay. I'd
definitely
love
send
to
that
share
to
that.
me. Yeah, cool. Thank you again, Caroline. I appreciate your time. Go do what you gotta do, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You take care.